Honourable Senators, I rise today as a sponsor of Bill S-5, an act to amend the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, to make related amendments to the Food and Drugs Act and to repeal the perfluorooctane sulfonate Virtual Elimination Act. That's quite a mouthful. So from now on, I will just refer to it as Bill S-5. It is one of the steps that the government is taking to strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA, the first such amendment to that act since 1999. Now, much has changed since 1999. Our scientific understanding of environmental risks to health has advanced. Sources, magnitude, and types of pollution have also changed dramatically, and our understanding of what we need to do to better protect our environment as we continue to modernize our economy while enhancing the health of all Canadians has improved in these last 23 years. Just to put this time scale into context, the top hit song in 1991 was Believer by Cher. The top movie was American Beauty. Internationally, sadly, the war in Kosovo started, and the euro was launched. In Canada, Nunavut became a territory, and Beverly McLaughlin became the first female justice of the Supreme Court of Canada. And on August 11th of that year, the Honourable George Furey was appointed to the Senate of Canada. CEPA is an important part of Canada's environmental legislative framework, and the Government of Canada relies on it to frame many of the environmental and health protection programs administered by Environment and Climate Change Canada and Health Canada. It also provides the legislative and regulatory basis for the domestic implementation of Canada's obligations under various international environmental agreements, such as the Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention, and the London Convention. Under these agreements, Canada has joined international commitments to, amongst other things, resist persistent organic pollutants and mercury. Personally, I think that this bill is a good step forward. It's timely and necessary. It moves the yardsticks in the right direction. It is in the interest of all Canadians that we have a healthy environment and that our environment does not harm our health. In order to realize this, we must move forward to strengthen CEPA. We can facilitate this process by moving Bill S-5 through the Senate. Our chamber is renowned for its committee work, and by moving this bill to committee as soon as possible, we will be able to give deep and critical consideration to the important issues it addresses. I will share with you why I think improving CEPA is important, and thus why this bill is important, not only for the health of Canadians and of our communities now, but also for the health of our environment and into the future. Many of you will remember some of the global horrific stories of environmental damage that put human health at risk. I was only 5 years old when Minamata Disease was first reported. It was a terrible, disfiguring, painful, and deadly disease affecting the central and peripheral nervous systems. It was caused by methylmercury, which was released in industrial wastewater from a chemical factory into Minamata Bay and the Shiranui Sea. This highly toxic chemical bioaccumulated and was biomagnified in both shellfish and finfish, which when eaten resulted in the mercury poisoning that was Minamata disease. The legacy of this chemical poisoning, while it led to significant improvements in environmental protection in Japan and alerted the world to the interrelationship of the environment and health, is not a story that charts a positive legacy in the relationship between polluter, regulator, and victim. Quite the opposite. The conflicts amongst those affected, the polluters, and governments continue still. Unfortunately, Canada was not immune from a similar mercury poisoning event. In our situation, however, it was intertwined with a blatant disregard for Indigenous peoples, the environments in which they live, and their right to health. I'm sure that everyone in this chamber is familiar with the Grassy Narrows tragedy. Sadly, its long shadow on the health and mental health of the local peoples continues today, decades after the Reed paper mill in Dryden, Ontario, dumped about 9,000 kilograms of mercury into the English Wabigoon River. Both of these tragic events may have either been prevented or appropriately remedied if a rights-based environmental approach had been in place. Such an approach is identified in the preamble of S-5. Clause 2, bracket 1 end bracket reads, quote, "The Government of Canada recognizes that every individual in Canada has the right to a healthy environment as provided under this Act," end quote. Honourable Senators, this will be the first time that this right will be recognized in a federal statute in Canada. This step forward aligns Canada with the United Nations member states' recognition of the importance of a rights-based approach to the environment. In 1972, the United Nations Conference on the Environment declared that people have a fundamental right to a, quote, environment of equality that permits a life of dignity and well-being, end quote. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child obliges parties to take into consideration the dangers and risks of environmental pollution when promoting the right to health. In October 2021, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed a resolution recognizing that access to a healthy and sustainable environment is a universal right and invited the General Assembly to consider this matter. Bill S-5 demands that an implementation framework informed by this right be developed within 2 years of its coming into force. This will be done in consultation with Canadians and will elaborate on principles of environmental justice and non-regression, as well as balancing of this right with relevant factors such as social, economic, health, and scientific factors. It also improves transparency by stipulating that the minister must publish the framework and annually report on its implementation. Furthermore, there will be a requirement to conduct research studies or monitoring activities to support the government in protecting that right. This provision would support work that is already in progress but needs to be enhanced, such as biomonitoring. It would also need to be supported by increasing national capacity for toxicogenomics research. Bill S-5 addresses both substantive and procedural rights in several aspects, including clean water, clean air, and the like. It also improves public access to environmental decision-making and enshrines the Government of Canada's duty to protect this right. The bill underscores the government's commitment to implementing UNDRIP and additionally recognizes the importance of ensuring vulnerable populations are included in assessments of actual or potential toxicity of substances and products, and in the minimizing of risks of exposure to toxic substances and the cumulative effects of toxic substances. It also stipulates that cumulative exposure and exposure to other substances which have the potential to cause cumulative effects need to be considered in risk assessment and risk management wherever possible. I find these directives to be forward-looking, for they recognize the importance of understanding subgroup differences within populations in susceptibility to substances, and not just focusing, as currently, on the amount of exposure defined as a whole of population standard. This modernizes SEPA in keeping with the emerging science in this area. Previous risk assessment was applied to protect the general population. Now this is expanded to protect the needs of vulnerable populations and as well to add in the impact of cumulative exposure to a combination of substances that can create risk because of this combination. Now I know it sounds complicated, and it is, but basically it means that it's not just one substance that you can look at, but multiple substances acting together in accumulation over time. That's a huge step. This improvement is in keeping with the emerging scientific discipline of toxicogenomics, defined as, quote, the study of the relationship between the structure and activity of the genome, the cellular components of genes, and the adverse biological effects of exogenous agents, end quote. Simply put, the science is evolving to be able to better identify toxic impacts of substances in populations. Some groups may be at greater risk for negative impacts of substances than other groups. Combinations of substances may create toxic impacts not found in each substance separately. and cumulative effects are important to understanding toxicity. Bill S-5 not only recognizes this, but supports the scientific work needed to address this reality. This is new thinking about the health impacts of the environment. And as a physician, scientist, and concerned citizen, I appreciate this approach. Through its amendments, Bill S-5 supports the need for improving biomonitoring activities that will help identify environmentally derived health risks in vulnerable populations. As some colleagues in this chamber know, Canada conducts a human biomonitoring component in the Canadian Health Measures Survey. Over the last decade, this activity has measured some 250 different chemicals in about 35,000 people. This work will now need to be enhanced, increasing the sample size, oversampling in vulnerable subpopulations, and increasing the number, size, duration, scope, and breadth of longitudinal studies, such as the maternal-infant research on environmental chemical study currently underway. For Bill S-5 to deliver on its promise of environmental justice, the research needed to support our ability to identify who is most at risk, when and where will need to be enhanced. Simply put, we can't move a better wagon without having the horses needed to pull it. The second set of amendments proposed in this bill relates to improving the management of substances and products in Canada. Chemicals make up every part of our life. We're a bunch of chemicals ourselves. They are both essential for life and potentially damaging to living things. We know that it is necessary for us to identify those substances that create risk to our health and our environment, and to manage that risk appropriately, effectively, and transparently. Canadians increasingly expect that our governments will act to protect our health and the health of our environment, regardless if we live in an urban area, a rural location, or a remote community. Industry also requires a clear, stable, and predictable regulatory environment to be able to produce what we need in a manner consistent with those goals. And that is what Bill S-5 aims to deliver. For example, let's consider the work previously done on lead exposure and its negative health impacts and how that was mitigated. Plumbism, the technical name for lead poisoning, can arise from exposure to lead in many different products, such as paint, gasoline, ammunition, foods, or in different environments, such as soil, air, water, or dust. It is the cumulative impact of exposure that counts. And a subpopulation is more at risk for negative health impacts, young children. The actions that have limited the prevalence of this disease have included bans on the use of lead in many different products, as well as environmental monitoring and workplace safety occupational health measures. This is an example of science, civil society, industry, and government working together to address a significant environmental health risk. But our challenges now are much more complex than simply single substances such as lead. One increasing concern that I, as a physician, have is about the multiplex environment health risks that emerge when substances that we know have cumulative effects may interact with similar substances and affect specific populations. For example, endocrine disruptors. Some of these are bisphenol A, phthalates, and polychlorinated biphenyls. These substances can interfere with endocrine systems, cause tumors, birth defects, and other disorders. They are found in small amounts in many everyday products, including some plastic bottles, metal liners and food cans, detergents, foods, cosmetics, and pesticides. While their interactions and cumulative impacts are becoming known, substantial work remains to be done to understand their impacts on human endocrine and reproductive systems, their environmental persistence, and the potential risk to human health. I, for one, was pleased to see that Bill S-5 has specifically identified this class of substances as a focus for action. SEPA provides the legislative framework for risk assessment and management with the Chemical Management Plan, which was launched in 2006. It has achieved some significant results. For example, Canada was the first country in the world to take action to limit exposure to bisphenol A in baby bottles and sippy cups in 2010. Mercury emissions into air and water have decreased by about 2/3. Yet much more needs to be done. 3 parliamentary reviews, including the 6th report of the Standing Senate Committee on Energy, the Environment, and Natural Resources, tabled on March 4, 2008, identified a number of areas where improvements to SEPA were needed to provide Canadians with better environmental and health protection. In 2006, about 4,300 substances already in Canadian commerce were identified as needing a risk assessment, and more recently, about 1,200 substances were newly added. Additionally, some substances previously assessed may need re-evaluation because of new uses, new scientific information, or greater exposure than what was the case at the time of the original evaluation. Bill S-5 is responding to that need. It will create a new plan of chemicals management priorities to give Canadians a predictable, multi-year, integrated plan for the assessment of substances as well as the activities that support substances management, such as information gathering, risk management, risk communication, research, and monitoring. It will also implement a new and improved regime that will prioritize the prohibition of activities in relation to toxic substances of the highest risk. It will enhance previous criteria for toxicity. The previous criteria used persistence and bioaccumulation. It will also add carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive toxicity, really important areas. However, I understand that currently it can take up to 3 years from the time a substance is deemed to be highly toxic and a decision is made about whether it should be prohibited or restricted. To me, that sounds like a very long time during which environmental and health risks can continue. Bill S-5 currently does not address this issue. Perhaps it should. In developing and implementing this new plan, the government will welcome public participation and consider the risk situation of vulnerable populations, including issues of exposure and susceptibility, as well as the cumulative and interactive characteristics of substances. As such, S-5 can provide greater protection for Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, or populations physically located in areas of greatest environmental health risk. However, I would like to once again underscore that these necessary improvements require a substantially greater investment in and improvement of Canada's biomonitoring and toxicogenomics research capacity. In order to be able to better use science and the technology that supports it, we must make the necessary investments in infrastructure and skilled human resources that we need to do the science. We must both improve our national capabilities and enhance our international collaborations to do so. We can't build the better house without providing it with a solid foundation. Bill S-5 also creates a watch list that will identify substances or products of potential concern so that consumers will be better informed and industry may use that watch list to choose better substances than the ones it was planning to use. This should nudge innovation towards the creation, manufacture, and use of greener and safer substances. An additional positive approach to protecting the environment and human health in Bill S-5 adds product to substance. Not only will substances that are detrimental to human health be covered in the amended SEPA, but products that emerge or discharge those substances will also be regulated. This is another step forward. Bill S-5 also adds greater transparency to risk assessment and management of substances and products. The first plan of chemical management priorities must be published within 2 years from the date of royal assent. In addition to welcoming public input during the creation of the plan, Bill S-5 legislates that any person may request that a substance be assessed to determine whether it is toxic or capable of becoming toxic. And it provides a timeline of 90 days during which the request shall be considered, and the person who filed the request will be informed as to how the request will be dealt with and why. This is positive. Bill S-5 also amends the Food and Drugs Act to ensure that the regulatory framework under the FDA considers environment as well as health risks. For example, if a therapeutic product may present a serious risk to the environment, thus reducing duplication, since currently new drug submissions are assessed under both FDA and CEPA. The Minister of Health will be authorized to act using one or more of a number of remedies, such as product recall, sending the product to a place, labeling, or packaging changes. Additionally, CEPA is amended to require holders of therapeutic products to inform the minister with respect to any serious risk to the environment that they become of, regardless of where or from whom the information was received. These amendments, taken together, will improve the environmental scrutiny of therapeutic products and help create a more streamlined regulatory approach for drug assessment in Canada, as well as improving coordination across government in substance risk assessment. Overall, Senators, I find this bill to be a good step forward. In the areas it addresses, it has improved CEPA considerably. However, there may be some tweaks that could be made to further improve it, and I have mentioned a number that came to my mind in this speech already. I am sure that others will want to consider additional items. According to communication from the Government of Canada, the government is open to strengthening certain parts of the bill via amendments during the parliamentary process. Thus, I am hopeful that this bill can be sent without delay to committee, where additional thoughtful consideration of its many complexities can be conducted, and that this good step forward can be potentially improved. Thank you, merci, Walalio, and Jakayu.
Senator